Here's to earning your keep." Brian's voice carried easily over the clinking glasses and hum of conversation, and not just sitting around collecting dust. The room erupted in polite laughter. Chairs creaked as people leaned toward each other, smiling, some nodding along as if he'd just delivered the cleverest toast of the evening. The chandelier's warm light caught the gold rim of his wineglass, and his smirk gleamed just as brightly. Everyone laughed, except me. I set my glass down on the linen-covered table, the stem making the smallest tick against my plate. My hand stayed steady, though the words I'd just heard slid through me like a thin, cold blade. Stories like this aren't rare. They're just rarely told. If it reminds you of someone, or yourself, comment 1 below. You never know who might need to see it. For a moment, I watched the flicker of the candles, the way their flames bent and straightened with each ripple of movement in the room. The scent of roasted lamb and rosemary hung in the air, though my appetite had already vanished. Brian leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. The birthday boy at the head of the table, 43 years old and feeling like the king of the world. His arm draped casually over the back of my daughter Laura's chair. She smiled tightly, eyes flicking down to the tablecloth. I turned my head toward him slowly, deliberately, letting the murmur of the room drop away in my mind until I could only hear my own breathing. "How will it feel, Brian?" I said, my voice calm even. "When you realize the deed you're bragging over isn't even yours." It was as if someone had knocked the air out of the room. His smirk faltered. The glass in his hand stopped mid-air. A fork clinked onto a plate somewhere down the table. Then nothing. No laughter, no chatter, just the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the tick of the old wall clock. I let the silence hang, watching it stretch like a taut wire. Guests shifted in their seats. One of Brian's friends glanced at Laura, who quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. Brian's eyes narrowed a fraction, confusion flickering there before it hardened into something closer to irritation. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, trying for lightness but missing the mark. I didn't answer him, not yet. Instead, I reached for my water, took a slow sip, and let my gaze drift past him to the window behind his chair. Beyond the glass, the yard was cloaked in winter darkness, the bare branches of the oak trees swaying slightly in the wind. Somewhere out there, a wind chime let out a low, hollow note. When I set my glass down, I caught the faintest tremor in Laura's hands as she adjusted her napkin. I wondered if she understood, even a little, what I was alluding to. "Margaret," she murmured under her breath, a warning or a plea. I couldn't tell which. I just smiled politely, the way you do, when someone has offered you something you don't intend to accept. The conversation limped on after that, though the brightness had gone out of it. People spoke in softer voices, glancing my way, then quickly looking back at their plates. Brian kept up appearances, telling a story about a deal he'd closed at work, but every so often his gaze would slide back to me. Curious, measuring, uneasy. I cut my lamb into neat, precise bites and listened without really hearing him. My mind had already left the table, walking instead down a different path, one lined with 11 years of memories in this house. Laughter and birthdays and Christmas mornings, yes, but also moments when a single careless remark had stayed lodged in my chest for days. When the cake came out, Laura lit the candles with shaking hands. Brian laughed too loudly when the song ended, as if to prove the earlier moment hadn't rattled him. But I saw the way his jaw tightened when he caught me watching him. He didn't know it yet, but the evening had shifted. Something had cracked open beneath the polite layers of wine and good china, and the air between us felt different, charged, almost electric. I kept my smile in place, joined the toast to his health, even took a bite of the chocolate cake. But inside, I was already somewhere else entirely, standing in my upstairs unit later tonight, opening a certain desk drawer I hadn't touched in months. It was strange, really, how one moment could hold both stillness and movement. The stillness of me sitting there, composed, taking another sip of water. The movement of something slow but unstoppable beginning to roll forward, like the first turn of a heavy wheel. Across the table, Brian raised his glass again, this time to thank everyone for coming. I met his eyes as he spoke, and I think, just for a second, he saw it. A flicker of something in my gaze that said, "You think you know the ground you're standing on, but you don't." The night went on, the plates cleared, the coats fetched from the hallway rack. Guests trickled out into the cold air, their laughter echoing down the driveway. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, I slipped upstairs without a word. My keys clinked softly against the hall table, the way they always did. I moved through the small apartment I'd made my own over the years, the lamplight warming the corners, the scent of lavender from the sachet in my dresser. And then I stopped in front of the desk. I rested my hand on the top drawer, the one with the faint scratch across it from when my grandson had been a toddler playing with a toy truck in my office. My fingers curled around the cool metal handle. Somewhere downstairs, I heard Brian's laugh again, lower now, muffled through the floor. But I didn't move, not yet, because once I opened this drawer, nothing between us would ever be the same again. I've lived in the upstairs unit of this house for 11 years. From the street, you'd never guess it's split in two. It looks like any other big suburban home. Wide front porch with a swing, white siding that gleams in the sun, and a maple tree out front that turns the color of rust and fire every October. The upstairs apartment was something my husband John and I helped design back when the house was just studs and framing. At the time, it was supposed to be a short-term arrangement, helping our daughter Laura and her new husband get on their feet while they juggled student loans and a baby on the way. Back then, they didn't have much, just hand-me-down furniture and a used sedan with a dented bumper. I still remember Laura calling me in tears one rainy Tuesday because the car wouldn't start and she didn't know how they'd get to work. John and I went straight over, jumper cables in hand. That's how it was in those days. We showed up, and after John died, I kept showing up. I didn't think of it as sacrifice then. It was just family. You step in where you can. I covered the property taxes when they fell behind the first year. I helped pay for new shingles when a hailstorm tore through in 2014. When Laura's second pregnancy was hard on her, I took over the school drop-offs for little Eli, made his lunches, even sat through his parent-teacher conferences while she rested. And the big things, too, the ones that added up quietly over the years. Private school tuition for Eli and later for his sister Mia, because Brian insisted they deserved the best start in life. Braces. Medical bills. Summer camp in Vermont one year because all the other kids were going. None of it was handed to me with a demand. It came wrapped in hopeful eyes and soft-voiced requests, until the giving became as automatic as breathing. That's the thing about generosity. You think you're building a bridge, but if you're not careful, you're paving a road straight to entitlement. Brian wasn't always like he is now. When Laura brought him home to meet us, he had that fresh-out-of-college optimism, talking about his plans to work in finance and provide for my family one day. He was polite back then, even deferential, shaking John's hand firmly and calling me ma'am the way his mother must have taught him. On their wedding day, I remember him leaning over during the reception and promising me, "I'll take care of Laura. You won't ever have to worry." I believed him. Somewhere along the way, that promise twisted into something else. Brian likes to be seen. That's not a crime in itself, lots of men do. But he likes it in a way that needs an audience. And the bigger the audience, the more important he feels. He tells stories like he's on a stage, embellishes small victories into grand achievements, and talks about the house as though it were the crown jewel of his success. He never mentions my role in keeping it afloat. Not to friends, not to neighbors, not even to the kids. Laura. She's harder to read. My daughter has always hated conflict. As a little girl, she'd try to smooth over playground arguments by offering her turn on the swing. As a teenager, she'd walk away from any fight with her friends, even when she was in the right. With Brian, she's learned to let his words stand, even if they cut into me. She changes the subject, makes a joke, or smiles like she didn't hear the sting in what he said. We have our Sunday dinners downstairs most weeks, though lately they've felt more like performances than family time. Brian at the head of the table, carving roast chicken with a flourish. Laura passing the green beans, making sure everyone's glasses are topped off. The kids chattering about school projects while I listen and nod, contributing where I can. And always some little barb worked into the conversation about how easy my retirement must be, or how nice it must be, not to have bills piling up. It's never direct enough to call out without looking thin-skinned, but over time, those small cuts wear at you, like water finding its way through stone. 2 weeks ago, at a neighborhood barbecue, I heard him telling someone, "We're letting Mom stay upstairs, out of the goodness of our hearts. She's comfortable there. It works for everyone." I stood by the buffet table, holding a plate of potato salad I suddenly didn't want. He knew I could hear him. That was the point. Later that evening, when I carried a tray of lemonade glasses back into the kitchen, Laura followed me in. She leaned against the counter, twisting her wedding ring the way she does when she's nervous. "You know," she started carefully, "Brian's been talking about maybe downsizing. Something newer, more manageable. It could be nice for you, Mom. There's a condo community just across town. Indoor pool, activities, all that. You wouldn't have to climb those stairs anymore." I smiled without showing teeth, the way I do when I don't trust my voice. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, setting the glasses in the sink. She let out a small breath of relief, thinking that was the end of it. It wasn't. That's the thing Laura doesn't quite see. I'm not clinging to the upstairs unit because I can't imagine living anywhere else. I'm here because of what this house represents, and because I know something they don't. A few weeks before that barbecue, a letter arrived in my upstairs mailbox. The return address was the county records office. I remember running my thumb along the flap before opening it, the paper dry and stiff in my hands. Inside, there was a certified copy of a document I hadn't looked at in years. The property deed. John and I had purchased this home with joint tenancy rights, a way to secure things for Laura's future if anything happened to us. But we never dissolved those rights after she and Brian took over the mortgage, which means that even now, even after all these years of me quietly helping pay for this roof over our heads, I still legally own half of it. It's the sort of detail most people would miss. Brian certainly has. That letter has been tucked in the top drawer of my desk ever since, right under the pen tray, where my fingers can brush against it when I reach for a notepad. I didn't mention it to Laura. I didn't tell Brian. But every time Brian boasts about his house or hints that I should be grateful for a place to stay, I feel the weight of that folded paper, cool, silent, patient. And I think about the day I might lay it on the table right between us and watch that smirk drain from his face. Tonight at his birthday dinner, I came closer to that than ever before. I could see it in his eyes, the uncertainty when I hinted that things weren't quite as he believed. Back upstairs after the guests left, I took off my coat, hung it neatly on the hook, and poured myself a cup of chamomile tea. The house was quiet except for the faint murmur of voices downstairs. I walked to the desk, pulled open the drawer, and rested my hand on the letter. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, calm but alert. It isn't time yet, I told myself, but soon, because something in me, something I've kept in check for far too long, has started to move. And once it starts, there's no going back. In families, the shift from gratitude to entitlement doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow erosion, like a shoreline losing ground to the tide, inch by inch, until one day you look up and half the beach is gone. The first time Brian hinted I should be pitching in for my space, It was at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning. I'd come downstairs to drop off a plate of muffins for the kids. Eli had chocolate smudged on his chin. Mia was trying to braid her doll's hair, and Laura was flipping through the community events section of the paper. Brian, dressed in gym shorts and a fitted tee, looked up from his phone just long enough to say, "Hey, utilities have gone up a lot this year. I was thinking maybe you could start covering your share. Just makes sense, right?" He said it casually, like he was talking about the weather. The kids didn't even look up, but I saw Laura's shoulders stiffen. She didn't say a word. I set the plate of muffins down in the center of the table, murmured something about having errands to run, and left. After that, the remarks became more frequent. They weren't requests. They were little seeds planted in conversation, dressed up as jokes or casual observations. "Bet it's nice not having a mortgage hanging over your head," he'd say when I walked into the kitchen. Or when friends came over, "Yeah, Mom lives upstairs. She's got it easy up there. Doesn't have to worry about the real bills." Each time I smiled the way you smile when you've been slapped lightly in public. You don't want to cause a scene, but the sting lingers. It got worse at the family barbecue that summer. Brian had invited half the neighborhood. The yard was loud with conversation, the smell of grilled burgers thick in the air. I was at the buffet table scooping potato salad when I heard him laugh from across the patio. "We're letting Mom stay upstairs out of the goodness of our hearts," he told a couple I barely knew. "She's comfortable there. It works for everyone." The letting landed hard. I kept my face still, the way you do when you're trying not to give someone the satisfaction of a reaction. But I could feel my ears burning. When I caught Laura's eye from across the yard, she looked away. That cut deeper than Brian's words. She'd heard them too. She knew better, and she chose silence. Not long after, there was the matter of the Thanksgiving guest list. Every year, we host it together. Me cooking upstairs in my little kitchen, Laura and the kids handling the turkey downstairs. This year, I overheard them planning without me. I was coming down the stairs with a basket of laundry when I heard Brian say, "We'll seat Mom near the end of the table by the window. That way she won't be in the way when the real conversations happen." The real conversations. I stopped halfway down the steps, clutching the banister, trying to steady my breath. Laura didn't object. She just murmured something about making sure I had enough room for my plate. By the time I reached the bottom step, my voice was steady again. "Put me wherever you like," I said. "I'll make sure to bring the pie." The kids started to pick up on the tone, too. Not in a cruel way. Children repeat what they hear without thinking. One Saturday morning, Eli bounded into my apartment, asking if I could take him to soccer practice. As I grabbed my keys, he grinned and said, "Dad says you've got plenty of free time since you don't have a job." He meant nothing by it. But I heard the echo of his father's voice in those words, and my heart sank. The tension boiled over one evening when Laura came upstairs with a stack of real estate flyers. "They're just ideas," she said quickly, laying them out on my kitchen counter, "places we could all be more comfortable." I scanned the photos, gleaming condos with manicured courtyards, a retirement-friendly community with a shuffleboard court. "More comfortable for who?" I asked. She hesitated. "Brian thinks, we think, it might be time for you to have your own place, somewhere designed for seniors. It would free up the upstairs space for other uses." I set down my tea, careful not to spill a drop. "Other uses," I repeated. Her cheeks flushed. "You know Brian's been working so hard, and with the kids needing their own rooms." I cut her off gently. "Laura, I've lived here for over a decade. I've helped keep this roof over all of our heads. I'm not just a tenant." She looked down at the counter. "No one's saying you are." But her silence when Brian said otherwise told a different story. The breaking point came on Brian's birthday, the night I'd made that quiet remark about the deed. It had been a long evening, full of his friends and colleagues. He liked to hold court at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, talking about his latest wins at work. Toward the end, after dessert, one of his buddies asked how he managed to juggle such a big mortgage with 2 kids in private school. Brian smirked and leaned back in his chair. "It's all about hard work and smart planning," he said. "Some people make excuses. I make moves." The words weren't just aimed at me. They were pointed, deliberate, sharpened. And then he said, "Plus, having Mom upstairs means we can keep an eye on her without putting her in some home. It's basically charity that works both ways." The table erupted in laughter. Someone clapped him on the back. Laura stared at her napkin. I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not anger, not hurt. Something colder. Like the moment you realize you've been standing on ice that's beginning to crack. I set down my fork and looked straight at him. "How will it feel, Brian?" I said evenly, "when you realize the deed you're bragging over isn't even yours?" The laughter died instantly. The rest of the night was brittle, like glass about to shatter. His friends left soon after, polite goodbyes masking their curiosity about what they'd just witnessed. I retreated upstairs without another word, my steps measured, my back straight. Later, when I stepped out onto my small balcony, I could hear them downstairs. Brian's voice low but sharp. Laura's trying to calm him. I caught fragments. Embarrassing me. In front of everyone. Doesn't even make sense. The October air was cool against my face. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and fell silent. I went back inside, locked the balcony door, and stood for a long time in the quiet of my apartment. My eyes drifted to the desk against the wall. The top drawer was closed, but I knew exactly what was inside. That letter. That deed. Brian thought tonight was about a remark made in the heat of the moment. He had no idea it was the first crack in the dam, and I was ready to let the water through. I didn't sleep much after Brian's birthday. The house was quiet, but my mind wouldn't stop. Every barb, every smirk, every polite silence from Laura replayed in my head. And underneath it all, the steady reminder, you are not as powerless as they think. By sunrise, I was at my desk, that top drawer open, the letter spread in front of me. The seal from the county records office was crisp, the ink still a deep, official black. My name, Margaret Hale, sat there in bold letters right beside my late husband's, under the words joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. It was the legal equivalent of a loaded gun, and they didn't even know it existed. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Helen McCarthy," came the voice, warm and steady, just as I remembered. "Helen, it's Margaret. I need a favor, and I think you're the only one I can trust with it." Helen and I had worked together decades ago at the hospital. Me in nursing, her in administration. She'd retired into real estate law, something she'd studied for while raising her kids. We'd lost touch over the years, but I knew she had the kind of sharp mind that missed nothing. When she arrived that afternoon, she walked into my apartment with a leather briefcase and an expression that said she was already 3 steps ahead. "Show me," she said, bypassing small talk. I laid the deed on the table. She put on her reading glasses, adjusted them on her nose, and began scanning. "You own half this property," she said after only a minute, looking up at me. "Legally, undisputed. And because of how it's structured, they can't sell it without your signature." I nodded. "And I don't plan to give it." Helen leaned back in her chair. "They have no idea. Not a clue." A slow smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Well, this could be interesting." We spent the next hour laying out a plan. Step 1. Secure my half of the property beyond Brian's reach. That meant transferring my share into a trust, naming my grandson Eli as the beneficiary. If anything happened to me, the upstairs unit and my 50% stake would go straight to him. Brian could pound on every lawyer's door in the state, and it wouldn't matter. Step 2, wait for the right moment. Not a petty argument, not another insult at dinner. No, this had to be public, clear, undeniable. a moment where Brian's confidence was at its peak, so the fall would be that much harder. I didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks later, Laura knocked on my door. "Mom, Brian wants to have a family meeting," she said. Her voice was careful, rehearsed. "It's about the future of the house." I kept my face neutral. "Of course. Let me know when." It was set for Saturday afternoon. The kids would be there, coloring at the dining table, and Brian had invited his cousin Mark. "Just for a second opinion," he said. I knew exactly why Mark was coming. He had a real estate license, and Brian wanted backup. Helen and I arrived 5 minutes early. I brought a manila folder. She brought her briefcase. Brian started the meeting like he was pitching a business deal. Standing at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, voice full of that easy confidence he wore like a tailored suit. "Look," he began, "the market's hot right now. We could sell this place for a huge profit, pay off debts, maybe even upgrade to something bigger, and it would free Mom from having to maintain the upstairs space. Win-win." Laura sat beside him, nodding occasionally but avoiding my eyes. I folded my hands on the table. "That's a lot to consider," I said evenly. "Exactly," Brian replied, "which is why we thought it best to make a decision soon, before the market shifts." Helen adjusted her glasses. "Before any decisions are made, it's important we're all clear on the legal ownership of the property." Brian gave a short laugh. "It's in our names. Laura and me, has been for years." I reached into my folder and slid the deed across the table. "Not entirely," I said. The change in his face was almost imperceptible at first. His brow furrowed just slightly as he read the document. Then his eyes flicked to mine, searching. This says you own half the house," I finished for him, "and that any sale requires my signature." Laura's head jerked toward me. "Mom, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Brian snapped. "Why wouldn't she tell us? This is blindsiding." Helen's voice was cool, professional. "It's also perfectly legal. And as of yesterday, Mrs. Hale's share has been transferred into a trust for her grandson, which means it's untouchable." Eli, still coloring at the table, looked up at the sound of his name. "What's untouchable?" he asked. "Something that's yours," I said gently, "no matter what." Brian's jaw worked, like he was chewing words he didn't want to spit out. "You set this up? Behind our backs?" "I protected what was mine," I corrected, "and ensured it will one day belong to Eli. You've been talking about this house like it's your personal asset to use as you please. It isn't." Laura's cheeks flushed deep pink. "Why didn't you just tell us? We could have—" "What?" I cut in, my voice sharper now. "Talked me into signing it over? Sold it while smiling in my face? Laura, you've sat through every insult he's thrown at me about living here for free. You've let him paint me as a burden in front of your children, your friends, your neighbors. And you never once corrected him." The room was silent except for the faint scratching of Mia's crayon. Brian leaned forward, palms on the table. "You're making this about feelings, when it's about what's practical. We could all benefit from a sale." I met his gaze head on. "The only thing practical here is respect, and that's been missing for a long time." He tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "So what now? You just sit on your half forever? Keep us locked in this place because of some vendetta?" "No," I said, my tone calm again. "I sit on my half until I'm gone. Then Eli decides what to do with it. You don't get a say in that anymore." Helen closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. "I believe that concludes our meeting." Brian stayed frozen for a moment, his hand still braced on the table. Then he pushed back his chair so abruptly it scraped against the hardwood. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, storming toward the kitchen. Laura stayed seated, her eyes shiny. "Mom, I didn't realize how far you'd go." I stood, gathering my folder. "Far enough to make sure I'm never spoken to like that again." Eli and Mia watched me as I crossed to the door. I bent down to kiss the tops of their heads, and Eli leaned closer, whispering, "Grandma, are you in trouble?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart, I'm finally out of it." Helen and I stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The maple leaves rustled above us, red and gold against the pale sky. "That," she said, tucking her glasses into her pocket, "was worth every minute." I exhaled, the knot in my chest loosening for the first time in years. Behind us, the front door slammed. Brian's voice, low and furious, carried just far enough for me to hear. "She's not going to get away with this." I kept walking, because he still didn't realize. This wasn't me starting a fight. This was me ending one. The week after the family meeting, the energy in the house shifted. It was subtle at first, fewer footsteps on the stairs, less noise drifting up from the kitchen. Laura's voice, when she called the kids in from playing, sounded more tired, as though she'd aged in days rather than years. Brian avoided me entirely. If we crossed paths in the driveway, he'd pretend to check his phone or disappear into the garage. Once, I caught a glimpse of him through my kitchen window, pacing in the backyard while on a call. His voice was low but tense, his free hand slicing the air in sharp gestures. Helen had been right. The trust and the deed had done more than secure my stake. They dismantled the illusion Brian had built for himself. For years, he'd stood at the head of that table, certain he held all the cards. Now he was learning what it felt like to have the deck reshuffled. By Friday, the ripple effects had reached beyond our walls. At the grocery store, my neighbor Carol stopped me near the produce section. "Heard there was some kind of property situation," she said, her tone a careful mix of curiosity and caution. "Brian's been telling people you blindsided them." I smiled politely, slipping a couple of Honeycrisp apples into my cart. "I'm sure he has," I said, "but the truth has a way of making the rounds." She gave me a look, half knowing, half sympathetic. I think people are starting to understand. 2 days later, I was coming home from the post office when I saw Laura sitting alone on the porch steps. It was early evening, the air soft with the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block. She looked up as I approached, her eyes rimmed red. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I sat beside her, the wood warm under us from the day's sun. "I didn't know about the deed," she began. "I didn't know you'd protected your part of the house like that, and I should have stood up for you, Mom. All those times Brian said things." I put a hand on hers. "Laura, I'm not interested in keeping score. What's done is done." She looked down at our joined hands. "Brian's been different, short-tempered, distracted. I think he's realizing the way he's acted isn't going to work anymore. With you, or with the kids." It wasn't an apology exactly, but I could feel the edge softening. The following Sunday, the kids invited me down for pancakes. It was the first time in weeks Brian had been in the same room with me for more than 30 seconds. He was at the stove, flipping pancakes with a precision that felt almost offensive. When I walked in, Eli grinned. "Grandma, Dad's making them just the way you do, crispy on the edges." Brian glanced over his shoulder. "Morning," he said. His tone was neutral, but his eyes flicked toward Laura, then back to the skillet. We ate together at the big dining table. The kids chattered about school projects and the soccer game next Saturday. Laura joined in, smiling more than I'd seen her smile in weeks. Brian kept mostly quiet, but when Eli asked him for more syrup, he passed it down the table without the usual sigh. It was small, but it was something. Later that week, Brian came upstairs. He stood in my doorway for a moment before knocking, another small shift. "I talked to a financial advisor," he said. "We're restructuring some things, making sure we can cover what we need without depending on outside help." I nodded. "That's a good plan." He hesitated, then added, "I know I've handled things poorly." I let the silence stretch a beat, then said, I'm glad you're handling them differently now. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. In the days that followed, I noticed changes. Brian stopped referring to the house as ours in front of others. Laura began inviting me to decisions about the yard, the holiday decorations, even the grocery list for Sunday dinners. The kids seemed lighter, too, as if the tension they couldn't name had lifted just enough for them to breathe easier. I kept my distance where it mattered. I didn't gloat. I didn't bring up the trust or the deed unless asked. The satisfaction wasn't in rubbing it in, it was in knowing I'd drawn a line, and it had held. The real moment came one evening in early spring. I'd just come back from watering the geraniums on my balcony when there was a knock at my door. It was Brian. He was holding a small, neatly wrapped box. "I wanted to give you this," he said. Inside was a brass keychain, simple but solid, with a small engraved plate. Margaret Hale, homeowner. I looked up at him. "I figured it's good to have the right name on things," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I closed the box and set it gently on the table. "Thank you, Brian." He gave a short nod, then turned to go. At the top of the stairs, he paused. "We're making pancakes again on Sunday," he said over his shoulder. "Thought you might want to come down." When the door clicked shut, I stood for a long moment, the weight of the little box in my hands. That Sunday, I did go down. The kids were already at the table, Eli's hair sticking up at the crown, Mia's face lit up with excitement about some school art project. Brian slid a plate of pancakes in front of me without a word, but there was no tension in it, just a quiet acknowledgement. Halfway through breakfast, Laura reached for my hand across the table. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm glad you're here." I squeezed her hand once before letting go. Me too. After breakfast, I walked back upstairs, sunlight pouring through the stairwell window, the scent of maple syrup lingering in the air. I went to my desk, opened the top drawer, and took out the deed. For a long moment, I just looked at it. This piece of paper had been my shield, my line in the key. Sand it had reminded me, when I most needed reminding, that I still had power. I slipped it back into its folder, locked the drawer, and set the key in the little brass holder on my dresser. Not because I didn't need it anymore, power like that you never throw away, but because for now I could let it rest. The real victory wasn't in winning the fight. It was in knowing I could walk into the next one standing tall. 4 months passed. Spring melted into summer, and the maple tree out front filled its branches with deep green leaves that swayed lazily in the afternoon breeze. The rhythm of the house had changed in ways that might not have been obvious to a stranger, but to me it was unmistakable. The Sunday dinners had returned, but they were different now, quieter, more genuine. The table didn't feel like a stage anymore. Conversations flowed more evenly, the kids interrupted without fear, and Brian, well, he still liked to tell stories, but they were about Eli's soccer games or Mia's school art show, not about his own wins. Laura seemed lighter. I'd catch her humming while setting the table, her shoulders less tense. She had started teaching again at the elementary school nearby, and I could see how being back in the classroom brought a spark back to her. And Brian, there was a humility about him now. Not a complete transformation, but enough that I noticed. He had picked up more freelance work, learned to juggle the bills without outside help, and stopped making casual digs about my free time. When he spoke to me, it was without the undercurrent of challenge. That July, Eli asked if I'd help him plant roses in the front yard. We spent the morning digging in the sun, our gloves covered in soil, the air smelling faintly of earth and fresh grass. Mia brought out lemonade, and for a moment it felt like the easy, cooperative family I'd always hoped for. As we worked, Eli looked up at me, his forehead shiny with sweat. "Grandma, does this mean the house is safe now?" I set my trowel down and wiped my brow. "Safe," I said, smiling at him, "and so is the lesson that comes with it." He tilted his head. What lesson? That respect is worth more than any title, I said, and it's something you have to give, not just expect. He nodded like he understood, even if the full weight of it wouldn't land until years later. In August, Laura stopped me one evening as I was heading upstairs. I wanted to say... She hesitated, twisting her wedding ring like she used to when she was a teenager, telling me something hard. Thank you. Not just for the past few months, but for everything. For holding your ground. I smiled gently. Sometimes holding your ground isn't about winning. It's about showing people you won't be pushed off it. She reached out and hugged me, something she hadn't done in a long time without prompting. I'm glad you're still here, she whispered. Helen came by for coffee in September, and we sat on the balcony watching the late summer lights spill across the yard. She asked if I'd ever thought about selling my half now that things had settled. I shook my head. It's not about the property anymore. It's about knowing I can protect myself and the kids if I need to. That's a freedom I'm not ready to give up. Helen nodded, a small smile on her lips. You've built yourself more than a safeguard, Margaret. You've built yourself peace of mind. On the first cool Saturday of October, we had our monthly dinner a little earlier than usual. The air smelled faintly of chimney smoke from someone down the street. After dessert, Brian surprised me by bringing out a small bouquet of sunflowers and setting them in front of me. They're from the kids' garden, he said. His voice was awkward, but there was no sarcasm, no performance. I touched the petals lightly. They're beautiful. Thank you. For a moment, our eyes met. His holding something unspoken, maybe recognition, maybe gratitude he couldn't quite say out loud. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the laughter had faded, I stood at my window looking down at the quiet street. The porch light glowed warm against the dark. From upstairs, I could still hear faint murmurs of Laura reading to Mia and Eli's muffled laughter drifting from his room. It struck me that while the trust, the deed, the legal maneuvering had been the turning point, the real change had been more subtle. The decision to stop accepting less than I deserved, even from the people I loved most. I wasn't leaving the upstairs unit anytime soon, not because I had to stay, but because I wanted to. It was my space, my choice, my proof that boundaries didn't have to break families. They could, sometimes, be the thing that kept them standing. The lesson I'd carried with me through these months was one I hoped my grandchildren would remember long after I was gone. Kindness is a gift, but without boundaries, it can turn into a leash. And self-respect? That's the soil everything else grows from. As I turned off the lamp and headed to bed, I thought of Eli's question again, whether the house was safe now. Yes, the house was safe, but more importantly, I was. Because sometimes the truest kind of safety isn't in walls or deeds or trust papers. It's in knowing you can stand your ground and still open your heart. And that's the kind of security no one can take away.